the Wild West, a name that echoes with the crack of gunfire, the howl of coyotes, and the whispers of ghosts carried by the desert wind. It conjures images of dusty cowboys, saloon doors swinging open, and duels at high noon, where men settled grudges with a twitch of the hand and a puff of smoke. But beyond the myth and the movie reel, there was a real West. A raw, untamed land where survival was the only law, and where civilization, such as it was, hung by a thread of barbed wire and bravado. In the years that followed the American Civil War, the United States found itself standing at the edge of an immense frontier. To the east lay cities and industry, the pulse of a nation beginning to modernize. To the west stretched thousands of miles of wilderness, deserts, prairies, and mountain ranges where the rules of the new republic barely applied. It was a place of opportunity and danger, where fortunes could be made overnight, and lives could be ended just as quickly. The war had left the country scarred and divided. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, north and south alike, returned home to nothing. Farms were destroyed, towns burned, and whole regions left in ruin. For many, the promise of the frontier, free land, gold, and a fresh start offered something the shattered heartland could not: redemption. So they went west, chasing rumours of wealth, freedom, and escape. But with them came something darker: the habits of war, the spread of weapons, and the taste for violence. The frontier became a place where old grudges followed men like shadows, and where the barrel of a gun was often the only judge. The expansion westward was not a peaceful migration. It was a collision of cultures, of greed, of survival. Native tribes who had lived on the plains and deserts for centuries suddenly found their worlds shrinking, their hunting grounds carved up by railroads and settlers. The buffalo, sacred and vital, were slaughtered in the millions. The land itself became a battlefield, not always of armies, but of ideals. The government encouraged settlement with promises of land through the Homestead Act, but in truth it unleashed chaos. Men of every kind poured in: farmers, trappers, drifters, and fugitives. Towns sprang up overnight beside gold strikes and railway depots, swelling with gamblers, prostitutes, and prospectors. Some of these places burned out just as fast, leaving only ruins and the stories of what once was. Law, when it arrived, was fragile. A sheriff here, a marshal there, often outnumbered and underpaid. Justice was swift and rough. In some towns it came at the end of a rope tied to a cottonwood tree. In others it was sold to the highest bidder. The West was not a single story, but thousands of them, of heroes, villains, and the many who lived somewhere in between. And out of this brutal experiment in freedom came legends, names that would echo across the decades: Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, Wyatt Earp. They became larger than life, symbols of rebellion, adventure, and frontier courage. But the truth behind those names was often bloodier and far more human. To understand the real Wild West, we must look past the romance, past the movie stars and the tall tales told in dime novels. The West was not a place of pure heroism or evil. It was a crucible where civilization tested its limits, a land that demanded everything from those who entered it, and often took more than they could give. As the sun sets over the Great Plains, the wind moves like a whisper across the sagebrush. It carries the faint echo of hoofbeats, of gunfire fading into the hills. This is where the story begins, in a time when America was still raw and unshaped, and the only thing certain was that nothing stayed civilized for long. After the war ended in 1865, the United States turned its eyes westward with renewed obsession. Railroads pushed across the continent, cutting through territories that had once belonged entirely to native nations. Miners flooded into the Rockies, dreamers drifted into Texas and New Mexico, and cattle herds began moving north toward new markets. Each step forward was another confrontation, another spark in a powder keg of cultures. The army established forts to protect settlers and rail lines, but their presence also meant the beginning of open warfare with the tribes of the Great Plains. For the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Apache, and countless others, the arrival of blue-coated soldiers meant the end of a way of life. Meanwhile, the towns that sprouted up along the routes of expansion, Abilene, Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, became islands of chaos. Gold and cattle money flowed like whiskey, and with it came conmen, gamblers, and gunfighters. Men like Wild Bill Hickok earned their reputations in these streets, enforcing the law with a revolver and a steady nerve. But even they knew the truth. In the West, the line between lawman and outlaw was as thin as the smoke from a Colt revolver. It was a violent, intoxicating time, when America's promise and its sins shared the same table. The West was a land of opportunity, but opportunity in those years wore many faces. For every prospector who struck gold, there was another who stole it. For every cattleman who drove his herd to market, there was a rustler waiting in the dark. And for every lawman who swore an oath to keep the peace, there was an outlaw testing how far that oath would go. The open frontier was too vast, too wild for law to reach every corner. The telegraph lines were thin threads of civilization, the railroads still a work in progress. Out there, between the towns, across the plains, deep in the canyons, a man could disappear. He could shed his past, take a new name, and start again. But some didn't just start again. They started wars against the law itself. After the Civil War, the land was filled with restless men, veterans hardened by years of fighting, used to violence, unfit for peace. The war had given them skill with weapons and a distrust of authority. When the conflict ended, some turned to banditry, seeing robbery not as crime, but as continuation. In their eyes, the banks and railroads that spread across the country were the new tyrants, rich, corrupt, and oppressive. And so, the outlaw became the rebel hero of the West. Few embodied that myth better than Jesse James. Born in Missouri in 1847, Jesse grew up in a border state torn apart by guerrilla warfare. As a teenager, he joined the Confederate bushwhackers, irregular fighters who raided Union towns, often killing civilians and burning property. The war ended, but the violence didn't end with it. Missouri remained a powder keg of divided loyalties and economic resentment. For Jesse and his brother Frank, peace felt like surrender. When Reconstruction brought federal troops and northern businessmen into their home state, they saw it as an occupation. And so, in the years that followed, the James brothers took up their old weapons, not under a flag, but under their own code. They began robbing banks and trains across Missouri, Kansas, and beyond. Their targets were not random. They often struck at institutions owned or supported by the railroads, symbols, to many poor Southerners, of Yankee power. To some, this made Jesse James a kind of folk hero, a Robin Hood of the West. He sent letters to newspapers proclaiming his innocence, painting himself as a persecuted man fighting injustice. The press, hungry for stories, turned him into a celebrity. But behind the myth was something bloodier. The James Younger gang left behind a trail of corpses, guards, passengers, townsfolk caught in the crossfire. One of their most infamous raids came in 1876 at the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota. The plan was bold, too bold. The gang rode in, guns drawn, but the townspeople fought back. Armed with rifles, the locals fired from windows and rooftops. In minutes, the streets were chaos. 2 townsmen died, but the gang was torn apart. Several were killed or captured. Only Jesse and Frank escaped. The Northfield raid marked the beginning of the end for the James Younger gang. For 6 more years, Jesse tried to keep his legend alive, robbing smaller banks and trains, but the noose was tightening. By 1882, he was living under an alias, planning one last heist. It was then that Robert Ford, one of his own gang members, shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. He was 34. The newspapers called Ford a coward and Jesse a martyr. His death cemented his legend, the outlaw betrayed by those closest to him, the rebel who fought the system to the end. Songs were written in his name, stories spread across the country, and a new kind of American myth was born, the outlaw as hero. But not all outlaws were seen that way. Some were driven by greed, others by rage, and some by sheer chaos. Among the most infamous was Billy the Kid, the boy who became a killer. His real name was Henry McCarty, though he also went by William Bonney. He was born in New York in 1859, but by the time he reached his teens, he was an orphan drifting through the rough mining towns of the Southwest. The frontier was full of boys like him, clever, quick, and desperate. Billy had charm and a crooked smile that made people underestimate him, but behind it was a survivor who learned early that a gun could open doors. In New Mexico, Billy was swept into a violent local conflict known as the Lincoln County War, a feud between rival merchants and cattle interests, each backed by armed men. At first, Billy fought for one side as part of a group called the Regulators, claiming to stand for justice. But like all wars on the frontier, the lines blurred fast. Soon he was wanted for murder, and the newspapers had a new name to print. They said Billy the Kid had killed 21 men, one for every year of his life. The truth was probably less, but the legend had already taken over. His escapes from jail were the stuff of folklore. Once, after being captured by Sheriff Pat Garrett, he slipped his handcuffs, shot 2 guards, and fled into the desert. Garrett hunted him for months before finally tracking him to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, in 1881. There, in a darkened room, he shot Billy dead. He was 21 years old. Even in death, the kid refused to fade. Some claimed he survived, that Garrett shot the wrong man. Others said he'd been a good boy driven bad by a corrupt system. His story became the prototype for every outlaw ballad that followed, the young gun who couldn't be tamed. But the West had plenty more where he came from. The Dalton Gang terrorized trains and banks across Kansas and Oklahoma in the early 1890s. They were a family affair, brothers who had once worked as lawmen before turning to crime. In 1892, they tried to pull off the impossible, rob 2 banks in their hometown of Coffeyville, Kansas at the same time. But the townsfolk fought back just as they had in Northfield. Within minutes, 4 of the Daltons lay dead in the street. Only one, Emmett Dalton, survived, riddled with bullets, serving years in prison before selling his story to Hollywood. Then there was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, perhaps the last great outlaws of the Old West. Their real names were Robert Parker and Harry Longabore, and unlike the violent, impulsive killers of the earlier era, they were professionals. Butch was charming, intelligent, and meticulous. He saw himself less as a criminal and more as an entrepreneur of crime. Operating at the turn of the century, Cassidy led the Wild Bunch, a gang that robbed banks and trains across Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. They planned with military precision, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed whenever possible, but even their cleverness couldn't stop the march of progress. By the early 1900s, the Pinkerton Detective Agency had become the long arm of the law. They had files, photographs, and telegraphs, the tools of a modern world closing in on an old one. With every robbery, the circle tightened. Eventually, Butch and Sundance fled south, to Argentina, then Bolivia, where they tried to start fresh as ranchers. But in 1908, local soldiers surrounded their hideout after a robbery. Gunfire echoed through the night. When it ended, 2 bodies lay inside, and the legend of the Wild Bunch died with them. Their deaths marked more than the end of 2 men. It marked the death of an era. By then, telegraphs connected towns, railroads crisscrossed the plains, and lawmen travelled faster than ever before. The old Wild West was shrinking, and those who had made their living outside the law were running out of places to hide. Yet even as their bodies were buried, their legends grew. Newspapers, dime novels, and travelling shows turned these men into icons. They were rebels, adventurers, symbols of freedom in a world that was becoming increasingly civilized and constrained. For a country that had conquered its frontier, the outlaw became a mirror of its own restlessness. In truth, the line between outlaw and hero was never clear. Many lawmen had been outlaws once. Some sheriffs enforced justice by day and broke it by night. The frontier didn't care for titles, only for results. And so, the myth of the outlaw was born not just from the violence of the West, but from its loneliness, from the wide, empty spaces where a man could vanish and become anything. The outlaw wasn't just a criminal. He was an idea. He was the shadow cast by America's hunger for freedom. The cost of a nation learning what liberty truly meant. Out on the plains, the wind still carries those names: Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, the Dalton Boys, legends carved from dust and blood, whose stories have outlived the towns they once haunted. In the Wild West, it wasn't law that shaped history, it was the men who defied it. But defiance alone could not hold sway forever. Every town, every mining camp, every stretch of open prairie eventually demanded some form of order. In this lawless expanse, order was not guaranteed, nor was it uniform. It was negotiated, enforced, and sometimes stolen. A fragile veneer held up by men willing to confront violence with violence. Some of these men were natural enforcers, born with a sense of authority, or at least a capacity for quick decision in moments of danger. Others were products of circumstance, shaped by hardship, war, and the merciless lessons of survival. They were deputies, sheriffs, marshals, and sometimes vigilantes, all tasked with enforcing laws that were often little more than suggestions. Towns like Dodge City, Kansas, and Abilene, Kansas, were emblematic of the frontier struggle to impose law on chaos. Cattle drives deposited thousands of cowhands into these settlements every season, men whose skill with a rifle and tolerance for violence far exceeded their understanding of civility. Saloon doors swung constantly in the hot wind, spilling whiskey and shouting into the streets. Gamblers, card sharps, and drifters multiplied the tension, and minor disagreements could erupt into deadly showdowns. It was here that Wyatt Earp began to carve his reputation. By the 1870s, he had learned that control of a town did not come from fame or brute force, but from presence, decisiveness, and the ability to anticipate chaos before it erupted. The mere sight of Earp walking the dusty streets, hands at his sides near the leather of his holster, could dissuade a fight before it started. Still, Dodge City was only a temporary proving ground. The frontier demanded its trials, and the crucible would soon take him south to Tombstone, Arizona. Tombstone in 1881 was a town on the edge. Silver had been discovered in the nearby hills, and money poured into the streets, igniting rapid development. The town swelled with merchants, miners, gamblers, and opportunists of every stripe. Its streets became a stage for the collision of ambition, lawlessness, and personal vendettas. Cowboys who once rustled cattle for survival now engaged in more brazen crimes, stagecoach robberies, armed thefts, and violent intimidation of local officials. The tensions in Tombstone were a powder keg, and they were lit on that fateful October day behind the OK Corral. Wyatt Earp, alongside his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and his friend Doc Holliday, confronted a faction of cowboys led by the Clantons and McClorys. For 30 brutal seconds, pistols barked in the afternoon heat. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead, and the streets were littered with spent cartridges and dust. In the immediate aftermath, the incident was hailed as a decisive stand for law and order. But in truth, it was far more complicated. The gunfight was less about justice and more about control. Tombstone's factions represented competing visions for the town. The Earp faction sought stability and lawful commerce, while the Cowboys clung to a freedom that allowed theft, intimidation, and corruption. After the fight, revenge came swiftly. Virgil Earp was ambushed, left crippled. Morgan was murdered while walking home. Wyatt, relentless, mounted what would later be called the Earp Vendetta Ride. hunting and executing those he held responsible one by one. In the desert canyons and empty streets, law and vengeance became indistinguishable. Elsewhere, the story of law and outlaw played out in different forms. In the New Mexico Territory, Pat Garrett faced the challenge of tracking and ending the reign of Billy the Kid. Garrett hunted him relentlessly, understanding that stopping the Kid was both a practical necessity and a symbolic act. In Fort Sumner, Garrett ended the Kid's life with a single well-placed shot. To some, it was justice. To others, it was the extinguishing of myth. Vigilantes operated alongside the formal law, often filling the gaps where official authority was absent. In Montana, Nevada, and California, committees of miners, merchants, and settlers banded together to mete out immediate justice. They hanged suspected thieves and killers from cottonwood trees, pinned warnings to their bodies, and left clear messages that no one could ignore. Some of these committees were highly organized, targeting road agents who threatened miners or merchants. Others operated more loosely, relying on rumor, suspicion, and personal judgment, leading sometimes to tragic mistakes. Innocent men and women occasionally became victims, their deaths reminders of the tenuous morality of frontier justice. The presence of lawmen and vigilantes slowly began to reshape the frontier, but change was uneven. Towns along railroads and near mines saw courts, deputies, and elected officials appear more consistently. Telegraph lines enabled quicker communication, allowing sheriffs to call for assistance before a conflict escalated to lethal violence. Yet even as infrastructure grew, the culture of immediate personal justice persisted. A reputation earned in a saloon or on a cattle trail could determine whether a man lived or died. Honor, reputation, and fear were as enforceable as any written law. The psychological toll on lawmen was immense. Many had to confront former friends, former comrades in arms, and men they might have once considered brothers. The decisions they made were instantaneous, often final, and almost always morally ambiguous. Wyatt Earp's actions in Tombstone, Pat Garrett's pursuit of Billy the Kid, and the work of countless unnamed deputies and marshals illustrate a central truth. In a land where institutions were fragile, morality and legality were inseparable from personal judgment, and as the frontier slowly succumbed to the encroaching structures of civilization, a new temptation spread across the plains and mountains, drawing settlers and dreamers alike: gold. It was the one word that could still turn a quiet settlement into a riot of noise and dust. The promise of it, even the rumor, spread faster than law, faster than truth itself. Across the West, gold was not just a mineral buried in the ground. It was belief. A fever that could make a man abandon his home, his family, even his name, for a chance to hold a few glittering flakes in the palm of his hand. By the time the lawmen began to tame the gunslingers, the West had found a new addiction. From the Sierra Nevada to the Black Hills, whispers of discovery travelled like wildfire. And each time someone shouted, "Strike!" the landscape transformed overnight. Canvas tents appeared first, dotting the hillsides like mushrooms after rain. Then came the shanties, rough pine boards, crooked roofs, smoke rising from hastily built chimneys. In a matter of weeks, entire towns materialized where only sagebrush had stood. Places like Deadwood, Bodie, Virginia City, and Leadville rose out of nothing, their populations swelling into the thousands almost overnight. Men, women, and children came by wagon, horse, or foot, all chasing a chance at the impossible. The air itself seemed to hum with ambition. Miners woke before dawn, picks over their shoulders, faces already streaked with grime and sweat before the sun even cleared the ridgeline. The clang of metal on rock became the heartbeat of the hills. Sluices gurgled with icy water as men panned for flecks smaller than a fingernail, each swirl of gravel a gamble between ruin and fortune. In Deadwood the fever burned hottest. Nestled in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, The town grew out of treaty land stolen from the Sioux, a crime that would echo for generations. But to the prospectors who flooded in, the land wasn't sacred, it was opportunity. They filled the gulches and ravines, their camps spilling over into the timberline. By night, the tents glowed like a constellation come down to earth, flickering oil lamps lighting faces hardened by dust, whiskey, and sleepless hope. The boomtowns were alive, vibrant, dangerous, unpredictable. One week, a man might strike gold and become the richest in the camp. The next, he could vanish into the hills, murdered for a pouch of ore or a winning hand in poker. Fortunes were made and lost faster than dice could hit the table. There were no banks sturdy enough to hold the madness, no sheriff strong enough to contain it. The law was still a luxury, and in its place came something older, greed and the will to survive. In the early days, miners worked shoulder to shoulder, bound by camaraderie and shared hunger. But as claims grew richer and the word spread eastward, the powerful took notice. Mining syndicates began buying up land, sending engineers, foremen, and hired guards to enforce ownership. What had started as a poor man's dream turned into an empire of corporations. Steam engines replaced hand tools, deep shafts carved into the mountains. Where once stood a handful of hopeful men, now roared an industrial beast, a machine devouring the West itself. Beneath the surface, thousands of men toiled in darkness, the heat and stench suffocating. Candlelight flickered against wet rock walls, and the sound of picks echoed like heartbeat and thunder. Cave-ins were common. So was disease. Each morning miners descended with a prayer and a cough, never sure they'd climb out again. Yet still they came. Still they dug. Because in the fevered logic of the frontier, risk was just another word for destiny. Outside, the towns pulsed with equal intensity. Saloons stayed open around the clock, 20, 30 of them lined side by side. Gambling halls, dance houses, and makeshift theatres offered distractions from the grind. The women who worked there, many newly arrived from back east or across the oceans, carved out their own kind of survival. Some became business owners, others entertainers, and many simply endured. They were part of the unspoken backbone of every boomtown, the quiet survivors of a land that promised everything but guaranteed nothing. At night, the main streets came alive in a haze of lantern light and laughter. Music spilled from open doors, boots struck the boardwalks, and somewhere, always, a shot would ring out. Disputes were quick, justice quicker. A gambler accused of cheating might find himself swinging from a beam by sunrise. A thief could disappear into the hills and never be seen again. And yet for every tragedy, there was another tale of fortune. A man who struck a seam of quartz so pure it glittered white even under moonlight. A woman who turned a single saloon into an empire. These towns lived and died by the same rhythm, boom and then bust. When the gold ran dry, the people vanished almost as suddenly as they had come. Streets once alive with shouting and laughter turned silent. Windows shattered by the wind, saloon doors creaking to no audience. Body, once called the sinliest town in the West, became a ghost within a decade. Its population fell from thousands to none. The mines flooded, the timber rotted, and the last echo of music faded beneath the howl of winter storms. But for those brief blinding moments, boomtowns were mirrors of America's wildest dream, the belief that fortune could be earned, stolen, or stumbled upon by anyone willing to try. They were testaments to ambition, to greed, and to the strange hope that somewhere in the dust lay redemption. In every boomtown there was a pattern, a heartbeat of discovery, chaos, and collapse. It was as predictable as sunrise and yet somehow irresistible. When one town died, another would rise hundreds of miles away, luring the same dreamers to start over again. The cycle of boom and bust became the rhythm of the age, a restless pulse that defined the frontier long after its wilderness began to vanish. Even as the law spread west, courthouses replacing saloons, judges replacing vigilantes, the gold fever refused to die. It was bigger than any badge, older than any border. It was the spirit of risk itself, of men and women chasing something just out of reach. And in the flickering light of mining camps and gambling dens, that spirit burned brighter than ever. Because for all the violence, the suffering, and the illusion, gold gave the frontier something no gunfight ever could: a reason to keep going, a reason to believe. As the years rolled on, the hunt for gold became more than desperation. It became destiny. What began with men panning in cold mountain streams grew into a vast industrial crusade. Mining towns turned into cities, and the West, once wild and unclaimed, became a marketplace of dreams and devastation. In California, the old 49ers had long since spent their fortunes or drunk them away, but new strikes drew fresh waves of settlers. The Comstock lode in Nevada transformed a barren ridge into Virginia City, a town so rich the ground beneath it glittered with silver. Within a decade it had opera houses, electric lights, and champagne flowing in the same streets where miners once slept in the dirt. Money changed hands faster than cards on a saloon table. A single good claim could make a pauper into a tycoon overnight. But just as often, the earth gave nothing back. The dream expanded beyond gold. Silver in Nevada, copper in Montana, coal in Wyoming. The West became a patchwork of promise and greed. Capital flowed from the East, from New York bankers who had never seen a desert or a mountain, yet owned pieces of both. They sent railroads crawling deeper into the interior, linking mine to port, camp to capital. With each new track laid, the wilderness shrank a little more, carved open by iron and ambition. The sound of progress was deafening, pickaxes, steam engines, and dynamite echoing off canyon walls. In the name of fortune, men drilled into mountains sacred to the tribes who had lived there for centuries. Streams turned to sludge, forests to stumps, and the animals that once roamed free disappeared under the weight of human hunger. The gold rush wasn't just a race for wealth, it was the conquest of nature itself. Native nations watched as rivers ran thick with mud and mercury. Lands promised to them by treaty were seized the moment ore was discovered. In the Black Hills, the same hills where the Sioux believed the spirits of their ancestors slept, gold fever brought soldiers and settlers in waves. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had guaranteed those lands forever, but forever proved to be shorter than a decade. When miners struck gold, the US Army came soon after, and from that breach came one of the last great wars of resistance. It was there that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse rose to defend what little was left of their world. The battles that followed, the Little Bighorn, the Powder River campaigns, were fought not just for territory, but for the right to exist against an empire of greed. The gold of the Black Hills would fill the vaults of the East, but it was bought with the blood of nations. Back in the boomtowns, progress showed its other face. The same fortunes that built opera houses and printing presses also bought politicians and judges. Violence didn't vanish, it simply changed its uniform. Instead of gunfights in the street, power shifted into backrooms thick with cigar smoke. Men like George Hearst, who began as miners, became industrial barons, controlling empires of ore, rail, and influence. The West had traded its bandits for businessmen, and some would say it got the worse end of the deal. Yet not all the stories of the boom were written in blood or gold. The fever drew people from every corner of the world. The hills of California and Nevada were filled with voices speaking a dozen languages: Irish, Chinese, Mexican, Italian, German, black freedmen from the South, women escaping broken lives in the East. For a brief, chaotic moment, the West was one of the most diverse corners of the earth, bound together not by culture or law, but by the shared belief that anyone could strike it rich. Chinatown in San Francisco swelled with immigrants who had come first to build railroads, then stayed to mine and trade. They opened shops, laundries, restaurants, small islands of civilization in the maelstrom. But prejudice ran deep. Laws barred Chinese miners from claiming gold, forcing many into the dirtiest, most dangerous labour. Racist mobs burned their camps, drove them from towns, yet still they returned, resilient as the mountains themselves. Across the territories, women carved their own unlikely paths. Some came as wives and mothers, following husbands who promised fortune. Others came alone. Widows, dreamers, outcasts. They ran boarding houses, bakeries and taverns. In some towns, women made up less than 10% of the population, yet their presence shaped the rhythm of daily life. They brought order where there had been only chaos, permanence where there had been only dust. A few, like Nellie Cashman, became legends, miners, entrepreneurs, and rescuers who earned the same respect as any man. Children, too, grew up amid the madness, running through streets thick with mud and mule droppings, playing marbles beside open mine shafts, learning to read by candlelight while the saloon piano thumped through the night. For them, this was not adventure, it was home. But home in the boom towns was fragile. A single dry season, a failed strike, or a railroad bypassing a settlement could empty it in months. Buildings were torn down for lumber, churches left standing like lonely sentinels in the wind. Ghost towns multiplied, reminders that greed could build cities but never sustain them. Even the richest seams were finite. The West was running on borrowed time. As the goldfields dwindled, attention shifted again to cattle, to oil, to land itself. The fever never ended. It only changed shape. What gold had begun, railroads and industry would finish. Denver, San Francisco, and Seattle rose from rough camps into real cities, symbols of a nation no longer discovering its frontier but owning it. And yet, in every plank and stone of those new cities, the old hunger remained. The same men who once gambled fortunes in Deadwood now built banks. The same drifters who mined the hills became sheriffs or senators. Progress wore a clean face, but the eyes behind it were the same. Restless, searching, always reaching for more. Even as the mines went silent, their ghosts lingered. Deep shafts filled with black water, tunnels collapsing under their own forgotten weight. Travellers wandering through the Sierra or the Rockies still found the ruins of that era. Rusted pans, collapsed cabins, scraps of iron half buried in dust. Each one a relic of the fever that built a nation. The boom towns had burned bright, then vanished. But their story was far from over. The wealth they produced fueled the next stage of America's rise. The railroads, the telegraph lines, the factories back east. The West had given its gold, its silver, its forests and its blood, and in return it was left with scars. Yet from those scars came the foundation of modern America. In the end, the fever never truly died. It simply changed its colour. Gold turned to oil, silver to steel. The same hunger that once sent men into the mountains now sent them into boardrooms and cities, chasing fortunes made not with pickaxes but with paper. The Wild West was growing older, but it had not grown wiser. Its greed, its courage, its defiance, all of it lived on, transformed, disguised, but still beating at the heart of the nation. The boomtowns may have vanished, but their echo never stopped. It's there in every story of ambition and failure, in every dream built on borrowed ground. And if you listen closely, in the silence of an abandoned mine or a wind-blown street of a ghost town, you can still hear it. The echo of hammers, the laughter of gamblers, the distant cry of gold, carried faintly on the wind. When the dust began to settle, and the echo of pickaxes faded into memory, the West didn't go silent. It changed its voice. Beneath the roar of saloons and the thunder of hooves, another sound rose, quieter, steadier. the sound of women shaping the frontier in ways no gunfight or gold rush ever could. They had always been there, though history rarely wrote their names. Long before the prospectors, long before the railroads, women of the tribes tended fires, raised children, and carried the rhythm of their people's lives. They gathered roots, tanned hides, and kept stories alive that stretched back before memory. When the settlers came, they were the first to feel the shock. The earth torn apart, rivers poisoned, buffalo herds slaughtered. Yet even in the ruin, native women held their communities together, becoming both shield and memory, the heartbeat of nations struggling to survive the storm. As the settlers pushed west, their women followed, some by choice, others by circumstance. They came in covered wagons that rolled endlessly across the plains, through deserts and mountains, chasing the promise of a better life. Inside those wagons were cradles, iron pots, quilts, family Bibles, the fragile symbols of civilization dragged into a land that had no patience for softness. On the trail, women buried husbands and children, mended broken wheels, delivered babies in freezing nights. They were pioneers not by legend, but by necessity. By the time the wagons reached their destinations, most of those women had aged a lifetime. But they built homes anyway. Sod houses dug into hillsides, log cabins with dirt floors and smoke-blackened ceilings. They planted gardens in the dust, hung laundry in the wind, and made the wilderness human. In mining towns and cattle settlements, their presence changed everything. Where men had built chaos, women built permanence. A boarding house meant meals, shelter, and safety, at least for a night. A schoolhouse meant there would be a tomorrow worth preparing for. A church, no matter how small, meant a place to bury the dead and begin again. But life for women in the frontier was rarely gentle. In towns where men outnumbered women 20-1, they carried both power and peril. Respectable women were scarce, and that scarcity gave them influence, but also made them targets. Many earned their living not by choice but by survival, working as laundresses, cooks, or soiled doves in the backrooms of saloons. For every legend of a gunslinger or outlaw, there were 100 untold stories of women who scrubbed blood out of shirts, who held dying men's hands, who buried their own in silence. And yet, even in the hardest corners of the West, there were women who refused to be silent. Take Mary Fields, better known as Stagecoach Mary. Born into slavery, she worked her way to freedom, then to Montana, where she became the first black woman to deliver US mail. She carried a rifle and a revolver, smoked cigars, and could outshoot most men who tried to cross her. She faced bandits, wolves, and blizzards, never once losing a delivery. In a land that respected only strength, Mary earned hers the hard way. Then there was Nellie Cashman, the angel of Tombstone. She mined gold beside the men, ran restaurants and boarding houses, and risked her life leading rescue missions into blizzards to save stranded prospectors. When asked why she did it, she said simply, they needed help. In a world ruled by greed, Nellie's currency was compassion. Others made their mark in more subtle ways. Josephine Marcus, the common-law wife of Wyatt Earp, saw the myth of the lawman from the inside. She watched the legends being written, half truth, half invention, and understood how the West turned men into stories. Later in life, she fought to reshape that story, defending her husband's legacy with the same ferocity that once fueled his gun. And then there was Calamity Jane. Part truth, part myth, all chaos. She could shoot, swear, and drink with any man in the territory, but behind the rough exterior was a woman marked by loss. She nursed the sick during smallpox outbreaks, cared for orphans, and lived her final years broke but unbroken. History remembered her as a wild thing, but her story was something deeper, a reflection of the West itself, rough, defiant, and human. The women who followed these trails weren't just supporting characters in a man's world. They were the West's moral compass, and sometimes its last defence against collapse. While men built empires of dust and blood, women built homes that outlasted them. They taught children to read, kept diaries that became historical treasures, and wrote letters that carried the heartbeat of civilization across the vast silence of the plains. But their stories weren't confined to cabins and towns. Many women took up arms, joined cattle drives, and rode beside men on the open range. Some disguised themselves as men to fight in wars or to claim land in their own names. Others became ranchers and landowners, managing hundreds of acres in an era when women weren't even allowed to vote. Their defiance wasn't always loud, but it was relentless. In the West, the lines between survival and rebellion blurred. To live, to endure, to hold on to decency in a place that rewarded ruthlessness. That, too, was a form of revolution. Women carried that burden not as heroes, but as human beings. Even the so-called fallen women, those who worked in saloons and brothels, played a role history too often ignores. They funded local businesses, paid taxes, and sometimes provided the only charitable aid in towns without churches. When fires swept through mining camps, it was often these women who organised relief. Some bought their freedom, bought land, or became property owners in their own right. Their existence revealed an uncomfortable truth. The West was built not just by saints and soldiers, but by survivors of every kind. And beyond the borders of white settlement, native women continued their quiet resistance. They preserved languages outlawed by the government, hid sacred items when soldiers came to confiscate them, and kept traditions alive in secret. When entire tribes were forced into reservations, it was the women who taught the next generation to remember who they were. In them, the spirit of the old world survived, scarred but unbroken. By the late 1800s, as the frontier began to close and the railroads tied the coast together, the women of the West began to claim new ground, political, social, and personal. Wyoming became the first territory to grant women the right to vote in 1869, followed by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. The same land once ruled by outlaws and prospectors became the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement. It wasn't coincidence. The West demanded strength, independence, and courage, the very traits women needed to survive there. By the time the rest of America began to debate equality, Western women had already proven it, day after day, with their hands in the dirt and their eyes on the horizon. Theirs was not a revolution of speeches or manifestos, but of endurance. Every home they built, every mile they walked, every letter they wrote, each was an act of defiance against the belief that the West belonged only to men. In the end, when the dust settled and the gunsmoke faded, it wasn't just the lawmen or outlaws who defined the West. It was the women who stayed after the men had gone, who turned rough camps into towns, who raised the next generation from the wreckage. They were the ones who gave the frontier its soul. By the time the century turned and the last frontier lines were drawn, the West was no longer a place. It was a memory. The mines had quieted, the railroads had carved the wilderness into schedules and maps, and the towns that once boomed now whispered with ghosts. But from the silence, something new began to take shape, not in the dust of the plains, but in the imagination of a nation. The cowboy was born. He was the last great symbol of freedom in a country that had run out of wild. He rode alone under endless skies, loyal only to his horse, his gun, and his code. He lived by the sun and slept under the stars, half man, half legend, a figure carved from solitude. America needed him, not because he was real, but because he made them believe they still were. But the truth of the cowboy was far from the myth. He wasn't born from the silver screen or the dime novel. He was born from necessity. When the Civil War ended, the railroads pushed west and millions of longhorn cattle roamed wild across Texas. Someone had to drive them north to the new markets, to Kansas, to Nebraska, to the rails that would carry beef to a hungry east. That someone was the cowboy. For months at a time they rode the great cattle trails, the Chisholm, the Goodnight-Loving, the Western, moving herds of thousands across rivers, deserts, and open prairie. The days were long, the work brutal. Dust caked their lungs, storms soaked them to the bone, and sleep came only in stolen hours beneath the hooves of restless cattle. They faced stampedes, rattlesnakes, rustlers, and sometimes each other. They earned little, risked everything, and disappeared without a trace when the job was done. Most cowboys weren't the clean-cut heroes later painted on movie posters. Many were young, some barely 17, drifters, ex-soldiers, freed slaves, Mexicans, and Native Americans, all thrown together by hunger and hard times. 1 in 4 cowboys was black, their names mostly forgotten, their stories erased when the myth was rewritten for white America. Men like Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, who went from slave to champion roper, telling his story in his own words, or Bossy Ikard, a trail hand so trusted that his boss, Charles Goodnight, had his epitaph carved in stone. The cowboys' roots ran even deeper, into Mexico, into Spain, into centuries of horsemanship long before the first American ever set foot on the plains. The lasso, the spurs, the saddle, the very art of riding cattle, all borrowed from the vaquero, the Mexican cattlemen whose traditions shaped the frontier. The songs, the swagger, even the language, rodeo, lasso, corral, came from them. But when the stories were written, their names vanished into the dust, and yet, for all the hardship, there was something pure in the life they lived. The cowboy existed on the edge of civilization, answering to no master but the trail and the weather. His world was measured not in miles but in sunrises. There were no clocks, no rules, only survival. He was both worker and wanderer, the last man in America truly free. When the drives ended and the herds reached the railheads, cowboys flooded into towns like Abilene and Dodge City, where the music of spurs mixed with the sound of gunfire and laughter. Saloon doors swung open to reveal smoke, whiskey, and trouble. Lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok and Bat Masterson tried to keep order, but often joined the chaos themselves. The cowboy's work was done, but his legend was just beginning. Reporters, dime novelists, and travelling shows began to take notice. They wrote of dusty riders and shootouts, of rugged men taming wild land with nothing but grit and a revolver. In the pages of those books, the cowboy became myth, a lone hero fighting both man and nature, uncorrupted by the softness of civilization. It was a fantasy America wanted to believe, especially as the real West vanished under railroads and barbed wire. Barbed wire, that was the end of it. The invention that turned open range into property, that divided water, grass, and freedom. By the 1880s, the great cattle drives were over. Ranches replaced trails, fences replaced horizons, cowboys became ranch hands, mechanics, or memories. Some moved on to the next frontier, Alaska, Mexico, the oil fields. But most faded quietly, their legend outliving them. Then came the storytellers. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show carried the myth to the cities, blending truth and spectacle until no one could tell one from the other. Cowboys rode beside Indians in choreographed battles for cheering crowds, their wars reduced to entertainment. Soon the frontier existed not in the desert, but under stage lights. The myth spread fast. Painters like Frederick Remington and Charles Russell captured cowboys bathed in golden light. Noble, brave, untamed. The reality, the mud, the loneliness, the broken bodies, was brushed away. The cowboy became America's answer to its own lost innocence, a symbol of independence that ignored who paid the price for it. But the truth has a way of surviving even under all that paint. Those who lived the life remembered it not as adventure, but endurance. They spoke of nights where the cold cut through bone, of dust that filled their mouths until they could no longer taste food, of horses dying under them, of friends buried without ceremony in shallow graves. Yet when they spoke there was pride, not in what they earned, but in what they endured. The myth of the cowboy became more than history, it became identity. It shaped the way Americans saw themselves, brave, self-reliant, destined to ride alone into the sunset. It was a story born from hardship, then polished into gold by those who never lived it. But it stuck, because it spoke to something the country feared it had lost, the idea that freedom was still possible. Even as cities rose and machines replaced horses, the cowboy remained, in songs, in movies, in the quiet fantasies of those who stared out windows and dreamed of open skies. He became not just a relic of the past, but a reflection of everything America wanted to believe about itself. Yet the real cowboy, the one who slept in the dirt, who sang to his herd at night to keep it calm, who carried blisters instead of glory, would hardly recognize the figure he became. He might have laughed, or spat, or simply kept riding, knowing the truth never needed an audience. Because for all the myths and all the legends, the real West wasn't about heroes. It was about work. Brutal, honest, endless work. And the cowboy, for all his grit and silence, understood that better than anyone. He didn't ride for glory or justice or destiny. He rode because someone had to. The myth of the cowboy didn't stay on the plains for long. As the 20th century dawned, the frontier faded from maps, but grew larger in the mind. The newspapers that once printed wanted posters, now printed legends. And then came film. Hollywood took the dust and blood of the real West and turned it into gold. The cowboy, once a hired labourer in a torn shirt, became a hero in shining boots. The grime was cleaned off, the hunger erased. His story no longer smelled of sweat and cattle, it gleamed with adventure. 1,000 miles of loneliness were replaced by a few moments of glory. The first Western films were silent, flickering shadows that brought the frontier to life for a world that had never seen it. In 1903, the Great Train Robbery changed everything. Audiences gasped as a bandit turned and fired his pistol directly at the camera. A simple trick, but one that struck deep. The cowboy had arrived not just as history, but as myth incarnate. Soon, the names of real gunfighters were replaced by larger-than-life figures. The Marlboro Man before cigarettes, the stoic rider before the storm. By the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood's West was no longer about the dirt and struggle of the trail. It was about destiny. John Wayne became its prophet, riding across technicolor sunsets, always righteous, always victorious. To millions he was the cowboy, even though he never branded a steer or slept under open sky. But the myth served a purpose. America was changing, cities swelling, machines replacing men, wars testing faith and patriotism. The cowboy became a kind of national mirror, reflecting an idealized strength and simplicity that no longer existed. He was independent when everyone else felt trapped, fearless when the world seemed uncertain. Every time he rode off into the horizon, audiences followed, chasing that impossible promise of freedom. Yet behind the fantasy, the real cowboys had already vanished into history. Mechanization replaced muscle. Ranches turned corporate. The long drives became trucking routes. And the people who'd built the culture, black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, native horsemen, were written out of the script. The West on screen became whiter, cleaner, and far less complicated than it had ever been. Still, the myth refused to die. During World War II, America needed heroes again, symbols of courage and duty. The cowboy returned to posters and propaganda reels, his revolver swapped for a rifle. The spirit of the frontier, they called it. Grit, sacrifice, and honor under fire. The West had become not just a story, but a language the nation used to define itself. Even as decades passed, the cowboy kept reinventing himself. In the 1950s, he was moral and noble, a knight on horseback. By the 1970s, he grew darker, weary, haunted, like the world he rode through. Clint Eastwood's squinting gunslingers and Sergio Leone's lonely anti-heroes stripped away the polish and brought back the dust. The cowboy was still myth, but now he was human again, flawed, tired, dangerous, real. Through it all, one truth remained. The cowboy never truly existed as people imagined him. He was part labourer, part loner, part legend, a reflection of what America wished it could be, not what it was. But maybe that's why he lasted. The myth filled the space that the real frontier left behind, a space too vast and wild for truth to survive unaltered. And so, the cowboy endures. In children's stories, in country songs, in the swagger of politicians who call themselves mavericks. The hat, the boots, the drawl, all borrowed symbols of a freedom long gone. Even now, a century after the last cattle drive, you can find his shadow on billboards and movie screens, still riding toward that endless sunset that never quite arrives. But somewhere beneath the music and the myth, beneath the celluloid sky and the golden glow, there's still the faint heartbeat of the real thing. The men and women who rode for a few dollars a month, who worked until their hands bled, who vanished without applause. The cowboy that history forgot but legend could never replace. Because the myth wasn't really about the West at all. It was about America itself, its hunger, its loneliness, its unending need to believe that somewhere out there, beyond the fences and the cities, the land is still open and a man can still be free. By the dawn of the 20th century, the West was no longer wild. The gunfire had faded, the trails had names, and the great open ranges were carved into neat squares of ownership. The sound of the telegraph replaced the thunder of hooves. The land that once promised boundless freedom now echoed with the rhythm of machines. Civilization had finally caught up, and in doing so, it killed the very thing it had been chasing. The death of the frontier didn't happen with a single law or battle. It died slowly, quietly, mile by mile, fence by fence. Barbed wire cut across the plains like scars, turning open range into property, ending the great cattle drives that had once defined an era. Where herds had once roamed free under the sky, they now stood penned behind wire and timber. The horizon, once endless, had become a line drawn by man. In 1890, the US Census Bureau made it official. The frontier, they declared, was closed. There was no longer any line where settlement ended and wilderness began. America had reached the edge of itself. It was a simple statement, buried in a report, but it marked the end of a dream that had driven generations. For centuries, the frontier had been the nation's escape valve, its promise of reinvention. Now, there was nowhere left to run. Towns that once boomed with gold rushes and cattle money began to wither. The mines dried up, the silver turned to dust, and the saloons that once overflowed with gamblers and gunmen stood silent, their doors swinging in the wind. Ghost towns dotted the landscape, rows of empty buildings, weathered signs, and broken windows staring out at nothing. You can still find them, half swallowed by sand and sagebrush, their stories fading like smoke. For those who had lived the frontier life, the change came like a slow suffocation. The drifters, the scouts, the cowboys, the trappers, they were relics now, men out of time. Some tried to adapt, taking work on ranches or railroads. Others drifted until the land itself forgot their names. They had chased freedom into the farthest corners of the map, and now the map was full. Even the outlaws found themselves without purpose. The railroads they once robbed were now guarded by armed escorts. Telegraphs could summon lawmen in hours, and banks no longer carried the kind of money worth dying for. Men like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid fled the country entirely, riding south into legend because the real West could no longer hold them. The age of revolvers and horses was giving way to the age of telephones and engines. The railroads that had once brought chaos now brought order. Steel lines connected coast to coast, carrying not only goods and people, but ideas, law, bureaucracy, uniformity. The land was no longer a mystery to conquer, it was a grid to manage. The same wilderness that had once tested the strength of men was now tamed by blueprints and ledgers. The frontier spirit, reckless, defiant, hungry, had nowhere left to go but inward. And yet, even as the frontier died, its ghost refused to leave. People mourned it without even realizing what they'd lost. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner captured it best in 1893 when he wrote his famous frontier thesis, that the American character, its independence, its restlessness, its relentless optimism, had been born from the existence of the frontier. If that was true, then what happened to the soul of a nation when its frontier disappeared? For some, the answer was progress, cities, technology, stability. For others, it was loss, a kind of quiet grief that settled across the West like dust. The land was richer now, safer, more predictable, but something wild had been buried beneath it. The men who once roamed free were now employees. The trails that once stretched to the horizon ended at train stations. Still, every now and then, the old world flickered back to life. In rodeos, in travelling shows, in the stories told by old-timers leaning against bar counters. They spoke of shootouts and stampedes, of endless nights beneath a sky so wide it made you feel small. The younger men listened, half believing, half dreaming, wondering what it must have felt like to live without fences. Because the truth was, America hadn't just lost land, it had lost an idea. The idea that beyond the next mountain, the next river, there was something pure, untouched, waiting to be claimed. The West had been its proving ground, its mirror, its myth. And now that myth was being replaced by streetlights and city blocks. The death of the frontier wasn't the end of adventure, it was the end of innocence. The realization that there were no more wild places left to conquer, only the wildness within. But even as telegraphs hummed and smokestacks rose, something in the American spirit refused to die. The hunger for freedom, for the unknown, for that feeling of standing alone under a vast, indifferent sky. It lingered. It found new frontiers, in flight, in invention, in dreams of the stars. The West was gone, but the idea of it, that restless yearning, became the heartbeat of a new century. Even after the dust had settled, the West refused to die. It lived on in the stories, and the flicker of a film reel, the twang of a guitar, the words of a dime novel. When the frontier vanished from the map, it was reborn in the mind. The cowboy, once a weary labourer riding through wind and mud, became something more. He became a symbol of freedom, defiance, solitude, and hope. Hollywood took that symbol and turned it into gold. From the silent reels of the early 1900s to the sweeping Technicolor epics of mid-century America, the Western became more than a genre. It became a language. Every gunshot, every sunset, every lone rider framed against the horizon told the same quiet truth. The West was gone, but its dream still mattered. Directors like John Ford and actors like John Wayne shaped that dream for generations. Their cowboys weren't just men. They were ideals, honest but flawed, violent but noble, standing between chaos and civilization. In those stories, America could rewrite its past, turning conquest into destiny, struggle into legend. The harsh truths of history, the blood, the theft, the broken treaties, faded behind a curtain of nostalgia. What remained was the myth. A world where courage always found its moment, and justice came at the end of a gun. But as the world changed, so did the myth. The old Western hero began to crack. By the 1960s, filmmakers started to see the West not as a place of purity, but as a mirror of the nation's darker side. Spaghetti westerns by directors like Sergio Leone stripped away the romanticism. Their cowboys were not clean-cut heroes, but desperate men in a world without mercy. The guns were louder, the dust thicker, the morals blurred. America was looking back at itself and realizing the West had never been simple. In time, the myth of the cowboy evolved again. Musicians, artists, and writers began to reclaim it, to reinterpret it. Country songs told of loneliness and longing. Novelists painted portraits of lost drifters and fading towns. Even science fiction borrowed its soul. Space became the final frontier, a place where explorers carried the same reckless spirit that once rode the plains. The cowboy's shadow stretched from the saloons of Deadwood to the stars above, and through it all the West kept calling. Even today people chase it, in old trails, in forgotten ghost towns, in movies that echo with the creak of saddles and the whisper of wind through canyon walls. Because the West, for all its brutality, holds something timeless. It's not about guns or gold or glory. It's about that endless hunger for freedom, the refusal to be tamed. The real West was never just a place. It was a state of mind, a dream carved into dust and myth. Its people were flawed, its history brutal, its legends half-true at best. But it gave us something we still carry, the belief that somewhere out there, beyond the fences and the roads, there's still room to roam. As the credits of history roll and the campfires burn low, the West remains, not in its towns or its trails, but in the stories we tell about it. Every time a sunset paints the horizon in gold, every time a song speaks of open skies and lonely riders, the spirit of the frontier breathes again. Because in the end, the West never truly died. It just rode off into legend.